So there were no border controls at all.
Yeah.
Now, the Trump people and the MAGA people in America, they don't talk about that. They'll say, oh, well, the 19th century is a period of high growth. We had high tariffs, therefore high tariffs work. Rich capitalists, these textile mill owners, they ground the workers into the dust, and they extracted profit from them. And that's how we got our riches today. And it's just false. The Fed allowed the money supply to contract.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today we'll be discussing a very interesting new book on economic history titled The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Myths of American Capitalism. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Donald Boudreaux, who is one of the authors of the book. Donald is also a professor of economics at George Mason University and a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center, as well as being a member of the IEA's Academic Advisory Council. Don, thanks so much for joining.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. So to start with quite a basic question, why did you decide to write this book now?
So the idea came from my co-author, former U.S. Senator Phil Gramm, who was a major figure in the Republican Party in the U.S. in the 1980s throughout the 1990s. He was a fiscal hawk. He was an ardent free trader. Even before he changed parties, he was a Democrat. But even as a Democrat, he helped to shape Ronald Reagan's first budgets. So, and he's a professional economist. He has a PhD in economics, and his colleague, when he was still teaching, later became my dissertation advisor. So that's how I got to know him. The idea was Phil Gramm's. He called me. He left Congress more than 20 years ago. But he called me in the summer of 2023 and said, "Look, I have this idea for a book. I've been writing lots of things." This is him now for the Wall Street Journal, basically debunking fallacies that people have about economic history, both a long time ago and relatively recently. And I want to put this into a book. And I'm told, he tells me, that you're the person who can really help me do it. And so we talked about the project, and I liked the project. And so we agreed to do it. And it worked out really well. And he is a professional economist. He had a lot of academic success before entering Congress. I'm a professional economist, but we both enjoy writing for the general public. And so we wrote this book not for our fellow economists, although we hope they read it. We wrote it for the general public. And the idea was to take 7 fallacies that he and I agree, play a major role in, we believe, distorting economic policy today, particularly in the United States. It's a work of half and half. It's really 50-50, written by him, written by me. So it was his idea, but it was a very satisfying project to work on.
Yeah. I mean, it's called The 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism, but so much of it seems very applicable to the debate in the UK as well. Particularly thinking in terms of your first chapter, your first myth that you want to attack, which is the idea that the Industrial Revolution, which of course starts off in Britain, impoverishes workers. Now, where do you think this myth, as you call it, comes from?
Well, the Marxists in the 19th century had it. It dates back a long time. People in Britain, while they were living through it, had the impression that they were being immiserated. That chapter that you referred to, that's the opening substantive chapter of the book. And it's really mostly about Britain, and not about the U.S. We have a little bit about the U.S., but it's about the Industrial Revolution, which is a British phenomenon. And, you know the fallacies that well, yes, we may be rich today, but that was all because these rich capitalists, these textile mill owners, they ground the workers into the dust, and they extracted profit from them. And that's how we got our riches today. And it's just false. And so we look at the best economic research done by serious economists in top journals and books. And we just report that there's no question that starting no later than the 1840s. That's the latest date. But there are lots of estimates that go back a century earlier. The real wages of ordinary workers in England and the lowlands of Scotland began to rise as industrialization improved. Living standards went up, real wages went up, life expectancy improved. By our standards today, of course, most people were very poor. By the standards of history, the decades, the millennia that preceded them, they were becoming a lot richer. Which is why Adam Smith could write in 1776, just as this is really beginning to be noticed. He can write an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He noticed that there was something happening around him. And he had traveled, of course, on the continent and saw that ordinary people in France and elsewhere in the continent, they didn't live quite as well as ordinary people in England and in the lowlands of Scotland. Something's going on. That's what prompted Smith to write the book. And so it's just a fallacy. The data on the Industrial Revolution in Britain are overwhelmingly in favor of the proposition that they elevated economically the lower classes, the working classes. They did not suppress them.
Yeah. Although, yeah, I totally agree with that in outline, but doesn't also quite a lot of the data say it takes a while for this to transfer through to workers? So you have this idea of the Engels pause, where the Industrial Revolution starts to get going in the 1760s, but it's not really until the 1830s that we see consistently higher wages among workers.
Yeah, again, the data are in the data. There's a little bit of disagreement in the data. Some data say it does start before there's some data that say it starts in the 18th century. But one of the things that's happening is as town and urban industries get going, that attracts workers from the countryside. That does keep those wages lower than they would otherwise be. But this is the result of choices of people being pulled out of being attracted out of the countryside from really desperate living standards into urban and town areas to work in the factories. So I think it's a little bit of a bias in the data that we have much better data on wage rates from the 19th century and late 18th century in the towns and cities than we have in terms of quantitative form of wages in the countryside. But we know that people were leaving the countryside voluntarily to move to the towns and cities, which indicates, because they're voting with their feet, that they believe their economic prospects were better in the urban areas. Yeah. It wasn't perfect by any means, but I do think when you look at the data in full and honestly, we get economic improvements starting for ordinary men and women, not all, but typical, in the mid to late 18th century.
Okay. Does British trade policy or British foreign policy more general play any role, do you think, in why the data seems to be fuzzier, to say the least, on wages?
Yeah, of course, Britain still was protectionist. This is what Adam Smith, of course, was railing against in his great 1776 book. And perhaps it's no coincidence that the data become unambiguously positive for economic growth for ordinary people in the 1840s, which is, of course, the decade in which the Corn Laws were repealed. And Britain, from that time through really the 1930s, for 90 years, became a free trade nation. And so certainly the mercantilist trade restrictions dampened the economic growth that would have otherwise happened had those trade restrictions in Britain not been in place. And when they were gotten rid of in the 1840s, I think then we saw a real release of the entrepreneurial energy and creativity of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. And is the story of American industrialization similar, albeit slightly delayed, or is there a slightly different dynamic there?
It's slightly delayed. Obviously, there was industry in the U.S. in the 18th century, but Britain was much more industrialized. I think the data for Britain at the end of the 18th century, I think just about 50% of British workers were in agriculture. The other 50% were in towns and industry. For the United States, it was 80 to 90%. The U.S. Was a land-rich country, and so it was still very agricultural. So the U.S. Industrial Revolution, if you want to call it that, the great surge of industry really didn't occur until after the U.S. Civil War, which ended in 1865. So you're looking now at the latter half of the 19th century. Now, Americans were rich even before that, because the agricultural output of the U.S. economy was amazing, and the commercial contacts that Americans had with the rest of the world was also very enriching. But starting after the U.S. Civil War, the railroads, for the first time in 1869, created a transcontinental economy for the U.S. California was connected to the East Coast for the first time by rail. The telegraph comes along, so you get instantaneous communication. A few years later, the telephone. Refrigeration emerges. And what happened in the U.S. in the latter third of the 19th century is these technological innovations, combined with, there wasn't a perfect economy by any means, but combined with largely a laissez-faire national government in the United States.
Except when it comes to trade policy.
Well, that was the biggest intervention for sure. But even that's a little bit misunderstood. There were periods where the trade policy got more restrictive and then less restrictive. And Phil Gramm, it's not really in this book so much, but we've written several things for the Wall Street Journal over the past couple of years. And one of the things that we've written is on 19th century U.S. trade policy. And what we found, this is a diversion now, but it's relevant given what you said. What we found is that the the growth of industrial output in the U.S., it was very fast throughout the entire 19th century. It would dip during periods of banking crises, but it was an incredible period of economic growth, there's no doubt. But it was inversely correlated, that rate of growth, with tariffs. So as rates were rising, that rate of industrial growth was falling. As tariff rates were falling, the rate of industrial growth was rising. Keep in mind, the United States, except for a very brief period during the Civil War, the United States didn't have an income tax until well after Britain. We didn't get an income tax until the 19-teens. And customs revenue was usually the major source of revenue for the U.S. government. So that itself put a constraint on how high the tariffs could go. Because if you raise tariffs too high for protectionist purposes, you'll keep a lot of goods out, and that's going to lower your tax revenues. And so the U.S. wasn't quite the protectionist monster that a lot of people today believe is. The story's a lot more subtle, but the data are certainly clear that industrial output growth slowed when tariff rates were rising and rose when tariff rates were falling.
That's really interesting. Because I had Alexander Klein, who's a British-based economic historian, on for an interview a few months ago, and he's looked at the data actually on a micro level as well, and he's gone through various U.S. industries and found that in the Gilded Age period, basically industries where you had higher levels of tariffs saw lower levels of productivity growth, and vice versa. So it's really interesting that you can track this at a macro level as well.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you protect an industry, well, the naive theory is that, okay, that's going to give these people room to grow. Well, no, it's not. I mean, it might give them room to grow, but it takes away their incentive to grow. They get lazy. I draw an analogy. I'm a college professor. I draw an analogy with my students. I said, suppose I were to tell you, well, don't worry about it. I guarantee you'll get at least 85 out of 100 on any exam that you do. At least an 80. So, you're not going to come close to failing. What do I think is going to happen to the energy and effort that my students put into studying? I don't think it's going to rise. They're not going to say, I'm so relieved I don't have to worry about my grades. Now I'm going to study a lot harder. No. They're going to say, I got a free ride. I don't have to compete. And so I'm going to study less. And we see that in the data. Doug Irwin, who is, in my view, the premier American trade scholar who's currently working, he did a very famous paper about 25 years ago now, looking at the U.S. 19th century. And what he found is that the service sector of the U.S. economy drove a lot of economic growth, and not the tariffs. And that's consistent both with the data that you just mentioned, the micro data, and with the macro data that Phil Gramm and I have found in later work.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and it's good to kind of flesh it out, because people often, I suppose, significantly now in the US in particular, seem to use that as a kind of excuse to support tariffs now.
Yes.
Yes.
May I say two more points on that? Yeah. So even though tariffs were, even those periods in the latter part of the 19th century when tariffs were high, and there were a lot of exemptions from the tariffs, by the way, it was also a period of extraordinarily rapid technological growth in communication and transportation. And so these things were lowering the cost of engaging in international trade. Now, the cost would have been lowered even further had the tariffs not been in place. But you have to weigh the natural economic effects of the lowered cost of trading coming from steamships as opposed to sailing ships, telephones as opposed to telegraphs, and telegraphs as opposed to no electronic communication at all, against the tariffs. And so in part it was because the actual costs of engaging in international trade were falling despite the high tariffs, that it helped propel this economic growth. The second thing that, well, I forgot the second thing that I wanted to say.
Well, I mean that first point I think is a really, really useful one to remember, that the overall cost of importing things,
yes,
was still coming down. It's still cheaper to import British goods in 1900 than it is in 1850. Yes. Even though if you purely look at a tariff chart, tariffs overall are higher in 1900 than they are in, say, 1850. Is that the sort of argument you're making?
That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
Oh, so the second thing I wanted to say, just very briefly, the United States had perfectly open immigration until it depends how you late 1870s, early 1880s. There were no border controls at all.
Yeah.
Now the Trump people and the MAGA people in America, they don't talk about that. They'll say, oh, well, the 19th century is a period of high growth. We had high tariffs, therefore high tariffs work. I never hear them to say,
therefore, totally open borders, that's, yeah.
And and there's no doubt that immigration also contributed to the enormous economic growth that America experienced in the 19th century. Bringing mines and what Julian Simon called the ultimate resource to the economy. And then, as Matt Ridley says, in his brilliant 2010 book, The Rational Optimist, ultimately our wealth is created by ideas having sex with each other. There's these ideas, and the more ideas you have, the more creation you get. And that's what you had in the United States when all these immigrants were coming over from Europe.
Right. Okay. I think we should probably move into the 20th century now, because there's lots more to cover in the book. So, what your third chapter is on the Great Depression and the myth that this is a failure of laissez-faire capitalism. Why is this a myth in your view? Was it not just the hangover from the lack of government intervention in the 1920s?
No. Uh,
Okay.
in the United States, again, it was a laissez-faire economy largely up through the 19th century, end of the 19th century, but it did have some deep imperfections, not the least of which was our unfortunate banking system. Uh, there were a lot of restrictions on banks spreading, so we had unit banks. Banks couldn't really diversify, and so we would have these periodic uh, banking crises. And they would last for a while, in 1873, 1896, and private forces would tamp them down. Um, and we had a big one in 1907, and that's what gave. And so we had a lot of private bankers chipped in to try to solve the liquidity crisis caused by this banking contraction. And then a bunch of people said, well, we ought to be modern. Let's get a central bank. And so the Fed was created in 1913, started operating in 1914. And at first, it didn't have as much power as it has now. And so we had a major downturn in 1920.
Yeah.
For the first several months of that downturn, I think for the first 6 months, the industrial production fell far more than what happened in the first few months of what became the Great Depression.
This is what known as the forgotten depression, because it collapsed, but then the economy recovered so quickly that who remembers the depression of 1920 to 21 today?
Yeah. It's forgotten because even though the Fed was around at that time, the Fed did not have the power to intervene as it had later. In 1923, there were various reforms to the Fed, concentrating more power in the Federal Reserve Board. And that, combined with the Federal Reserve Board's wacky adherence to this notion called the real bills doctrine, which is too much for us to get into here, but it was just a mistaken view of how monetary policy should be conducted. When we got a downturn in October, it started in August of 1929, the Fed overreacted. The Fed allowed the money supply to contract by more than 30%.
Yeah. This is because people are pulling their money out of banks because they think the bank is going to go under. And yet the Fed is also pursuing contractionary monetary policy as well.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the Fed allowed the money supply to contract. And it was a massive failure of monetary policy. This is well documented in Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's great 1963 book on history of monetary policy in the United States. So that's the Great as it's called now, the Great Contraction. I have no doubt that that's the single largest cause of the Great Depression. Now, there's a second question, and that is, why did it last so long? I don't think it lasted so long because of the Great Contraction. The economies are very robust. They can normally recover. The reason it lasted, here's another myth in the United States, is that, well, Herbert Hoover, who was president when the Great Depression began, he was this dogmatic a proponent of laissez-faire capitalism, and so he did nothing and just let the economy flounder. And of course, the economy continued to flounder. Fortunately, Franklin Roosevelt swept into office in 1933 with his brain trust and New Dealers, and they had all these brilliant ideas for brilliant modern ideas for saving the economy from recession. And so we got the New Deal, and that started to improve things. But oh my gosh, it was so deep and so bad because laissez-faire led us into such a mire of recession that, really, we couldn't get out of it until finally, thank goodness, we get into World War II. And so the wartime spending combined with conscripting millions of young men into the military finally puts an end to the Depression. And this is so wrong, although this is the kind of stuff that's still taught in American high schools and American history
and
classes.
British ones as well. I speak from personal experience.
No doubt. I mean, it begins with the fact that Herbert Hoover was not at all laissez-faire. Herbert Hoover was a modern man. at the time. He was a young guy, and he had all these modern ideas, modern progressive ideas for how an economy should operate. And by the way, Herbert Hoover also signed the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930. Now, I don't believe that the Smoot-Hawley tariff caused the Depression. I don't even believe that it was a major factor in extending it, but it certainly didn't help.
Yeah.
And it added a little bit of depressing effect.
Just to clarify, this is a very high tariff on imports to the US.
The US.
Which leads to a decline in international trade, countries responding with retaliatory tariffs. And so global trade also goes into a depression. That's just to clarify.
That's it. Yes. Thank you for that. Yes, it is. Depending on how you measure these things, it is either the first or second highest tariff increase in American economic history. Agriculture, industry, it was across the board. But it was not the cause of the Great Depression. What I think extended the Great Depression, why the economy didn't recover after the great contraction of the money supply, was first Hoover's unprecedented economic interventions. People had never seen anything like this before, not in peacetime, and seen it in wartime. And then, even worse, Franklin Roosevelt, who comes into office and becomes increasingly, during the 1930s, hostile, both in action and in word, toward private enterprise. And so investors basically said, I'm staying on the sideline. I'm not investing. Why should I invest if the returns are going to be taxed away in a confiscatory way? Maybe even the property rights themselves aren't secure anymore. And the great economic historian Bob Higgs, we use his work in this book, I think he makes a compelling case that the reason the Great Depression lasted as long as it did was because of what Higgs calls regime uncertainty, that particularly under Franklin Roosevelt, that investors were just too frightened about the economic policies that were in play then, so they stayed on the sidelines. So we get to World War II, and then it will become a wartime economy, and you can't really judge how well a market is doing when you're in a wartime economy. Price controls, governments, taking over industries. Bob Higgs argues, and we endorse this argument in our book, that really you can't say that the Great Depression ended for sure until in the year or two after World War II, 1946 or 1947. That's when finally we return to a peacetime economy. Franklin Roosevelt is dead. Harry Truman, also a Democrat, wasn't anywhere nearly as ideologically opposed to capitalism as FDR had become. And so we recover from the Great Depression finally some 16 or 17 years after it sputs. Yep.
I think one of the really interesting points you bring up in this chapter is something that many people, even in Britain, are unfamiliar with, which is that countries like Britain did actually really quite well in the mid to late 1930s economically, and most other countries recovered much more rapidly than Roosevelt than the US, despite the fact Britain did not pursue a policy of massive government expansion. In fact, quite the opposite. It had fiscal contraction but also quite liberal monetary policy.
Yeah, when Britain got off of Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 at a price that was way too high. And then it corrected that mistake by getting off the gold standard in 1931, which certainly helped things. The only other country, Dan, that was like the U.S. in terms of the depth and the extent, the length of the Depression was France. And it's no surprise that France was the European country that pursued policies as close to U.S. New Deal policies than did any other European country. My former colleague and very good friend George Selgin has a wonderful new book out called False Dawn, looking at, basically asking the question, did Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, we cited in our book, did Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, how responsible was it for getting the U.S. out of the Depression? And the answer is, not really.
Yeah.
It didn't really help very much. It probably hurt.
Although isn't one of George Selgin's arguments that one of the issues was that FDR's policy was very nervous about fiscal expansion. He's very, very nervous about deficit spending, and also very, very nervous about monetary expansion.
Yes. So
Which is something people often don't think of. We think of, oh yeah, FDR was like a proto-Keynesian, which seems not to be the case.
He wasn't. Keynes was not fond of FDR because FDR uh, uh, wasn't as enthusiastic as Keynes had become about using the budget as a countercyclical measure. On this matter, I think Roosevelt was right, Keynes was wrong. On the other hand, Keynes also wisely warned Roosevelt against his more direct interventions. You know, the attempt to cartelize U.S. industry, and Keynes was a good enough economist to realize that that's counterproductive. But one of the fallacies that I think a lot of American college students still get is, well, you know, Keynes and Roosevelt were pretty much alike, and they actually agreed on very, very little. Keynes was no fan of Roosevelt's New Deal.
Yeah. No, I think that's very interesting. And so your argument that the main issue with Roosevelt is that he creates an unstable business environment, which means that business is very reluctant to start investing again, and is very, very cautious because they don't know if they're going to be hit by some big new federal requirement of one sort or another.
That's exactly right. Or had the returns from their investments basically confiscated in very high tax rates. And Bob Higgs, the historian I mentioned earlier, has empirical evidence that I think very strongly supports that interpretation of why the Great Depression lasted as long as it did.
Okay. Yeah, but really interesting. So we've already touched on the next topic, a bit to do with US trade policy. Your fourth chapter is on the idea that trade has hollowed out American manufacturing, especially in the sort of post-1970s period. I think one of the points you make initially is just that, American manufacturing hasn't been hollowed out in real terms. It's just other people have started manufacturing more as well. Could you get into that a bit?
Yeah, the story you hear in the United States. First of all, I think it's impossible if you're in the U.S. to read a newspaper, read magazines, go online without at least once a day finding some reasonably prominent person using that very term. Well, our industry has been hollowed out. Well, you look for it in the data, and you simply don't find it. American industrial output today is at an all-time high, or very close to an all-time high. Somewhat more narrower concept, manufacturing output is very near an all-time high. Industrial capacity is at an all-time high. The myth is that, well, you know, after World War II, America dominated the world in manufacturing. And it did, of course. That's what happens when other countries are in rubble. A destroyed factory can't compete. Well, the world starts recovering, and this hollowed out story goes something like this. Well, you know, about mid-1970s, Europe finally recovers from World War II, and then American manufacturing starts to disappear. And America began running annual trade deficits, and this is true, starting in 1976. And we've run annual trade deficits ever since. And this is taken to be evidence that U.S. manufacturing has been hollowed out. But if you look at the data, you find it's just not true. American manufacturing output over those years has churned steadily up. It hit its all-time peak just before the Great Recession in 2007. It fell and fell again during COVID, and it went back up. Industrial capacity has steadily increased. Now, look, America is, like all advanced economies, mostly a service economy. And as we become richer, services become an ever larger part of the economy, portion of the economy. And so it's rather amazing, actually, that our industrial output continues to be what it is in America, given that the service sector is an ever larger part of it. Now, people will say, "Oh, service sector, that's terrible," because they're thinking of people at McDonald's, flipping hamburgers. Well, that is a service sector job, but you and I are in the service sector. Donald Trump is in the service sector. My physicians are in the service sector. Web designers are in the service sector. Taylor Swift and Paul McCartney are in the service sector. So service sector jobs are in general higher paying than manufacturing jobs. But anyway, the United States has not become hollowed out by increased trade with foreign countries. The trade deficit, although it is real, has not hollowed out America's trade. If you look at the growth in real wages, and real wages not even in general, real wages of what the Bureau of Labor Statistics classifies as production and non-supervisory workers. Production line workers.
Not people working in factories, basically.
Working in factories, working, clerical jobs. Those wages are today, hourly wages are at an all-time high. And so a lot of the passion for Donald Trump's protectionism is built on a completely backwards understanding of the current state of the American economy. He and other people have, I have to say, this fallacy began not with people on the right in America. It began with people on the left. Starting about 30 years ago, because they didn't like Ronald Reagan. So look at those Reagan years. Oh, look, manufacturing's being hollowed out and wages are stagnating. And it wasn't true then, and it's certainly not true now, but that's been taken over. That narrative has been taken over big time by people on the right, especially people on the MAGA right, the Donald Trump right. And it's just it's a complete fallacy. You cannot find any reliable data to support it. But trying to convince people that it's a fallacy is very difficult because they hear it every day, and it is stated in the media in the U.S. as if it is a fact as indisputable as gravity.
Yeah.
And it's not true.
How would you, if I'm to defend this position slightly, how would you respond to the suggestion that, okay, even on the aggregate, US manufacturing has not declined, but in specific regions, trade does seem to have played a role in an absolute decline in those regions, most notoriously in parts of the Rust Belt, in Detroit, in various bits of Ohio. Would you accept there have been any particular regions that have seen their manufacturing hollowed out as a result of trade?
There certainly are particular regions in which manufacturing output has declined, of course. That doesn't mean those regions are doing worse. There are a few things to say, and that's a very, very good point, by the way. And it's an important one. A handful of things. Number one, my former student at George Mason, a guy named Jeremy Horpedahl, recently he went back to what you're referring to, it really is the famous China shock syndrome that looks at those particular commuting zones in the U.S., as they're called, that allegedly were especially hard hit by increased trade from China, which has helped to fuel a lot of the current enthusiasm for protectionism in America. And what Jeremy Horpedahl finds, and I think it's a very convincing piece of research, is that all of those regions, every one of those regions, is doing better now than it was doing prior to the beginning of the so-called China shock period. So, as with all,
is this in terms of wages or
wages, standard of living? Yes, the quality of life, however measured, of people in those regions. And of course, you can find individuals who aren't doing as well. That's always the case. So that's one thing to point out. Now, some people say, well, maybe they would be doing even better. Well, maybe, but they're not. They are, in absolute terms, doing better than they were 20 years ago or 25 years ago, just as the China shock was getting alleged China shock was getting underway. A second thing to say is that people had looked at the extent to which manufacturing jobs have been destroyed in America by trade as compared to, or as opposed to, being destroyed by labor-saving technology. And there are various estimates, but I know of no estimate that gives trade the majority of the blame for destroying manufacturing jobs. The best study that I've seen says that about 85%, 87% to be precise, of the job losses to in manufacturing have come from labor-saving technology, not from trade. And this is consistent with this fact. Although manufacturing employment in the U.S. has been steadily falling for the past literally 70 years, since before I was born, manufacturing output for most of that time has gone steadily up. Well, that is a result of labor-saving technology. Combine that fact with the fact that in all industrialized countries, the share of the employment in manufacturing is falling. That's true now even in China. And the third thing to say is that, the United States is still, policies vary from state to state. And the economist Gary Winslett has done some research showing that in the Rust Belt areas, to the extent that they are not booming as much as, say, in other parts of the U.S., that's more attributable to the unfortunate economic interventions that remain in those areas, labor laws, high taxes, as opposed to the American South and the American Southwest that have less regulation, easier labor laws, and lower taxes. But again, even these so-called Rust Belt areas that were affected by the China shock, they're better off today than they were before.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, particularly on the idea that a lot of the competition is coming from other parts of the US. So, car manufacturers shifting from Michigan to Georgia, for example, because of more, appealing labor laws and that kind of thing. Just on a final point on trade, how one of the arguments that is sometimes made by people who accept all of these economic arguments in favor of free trade will say, yes, but for national security reasons, it's very important that we maintain a large manufacturing sector, because what if we go to war with China, for example? How do you deal with that question of national security and trading?
Yeah, I think it is unavoidable that there is a national security exception to the case for free trade. But let's be clear, this is an exception that says, okay, we're willing to suffer a little bit slower economic growth in favor of stronger national security. That said, you have to be really careful with that exception. Once you admit it, then every industry is going to come to Washington, D.C. and claim that it is essential to national security. And so I think the presumption should be against protecting any industry and put the burden on that industry. The second thing to say about this, even if, say, you and I are utterly convinced today that industry X is essential to national security, so we want to protect it, there's a downside. When you protect that industry, you make it lazier, you make it less innovative. And so maybe today's protection might increase today's national security, but it might decrease tomorrow's national security. That's a trade-off that I see very, very few people recognizing, and it to be put into the mix. A third thing to say, a much more practical thing to say, is there's no way you can justify Trump 1.0, Biden's trade policies, Trump 2.0's trade policies on national security grounds. They are simply too broad-based.
Yeah.
They hit allies just as much, in some cases harder, than they hit alleged enemies. And so if the concern really were national security, you would see a much more targeted, serious-minded, scalpel-like imposition of tariffs rather than this shotgun, maniacal imposition of tariffs. So I just don't believe that these people are serious when they say that they're doing it for national security purposes. National security is just too easy an excuse to pull out to justify those tariffs and silence people who might object to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the sort of darkly amusing aspect of the initial Liberation Day tariffs was Madagascar got hit by some of the highest levels of tariffs because they export lots of vanilla to the US, which doesn't really grow as the US. So it's hard to see I like vanilla ice cream, but it's kind of hard to see the national security interest in,
you have to be excessively creative to make that case. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in this book that we could talk about. There's other sections on the myth of rising income inequality in the US, poverty, the causes of the 2008 financial crisis, but I don't want to spoil all of the book so people don't buy it. So I think we will call it a day there. So Donald Boudreaux, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Dan. I have long been a big fan of the IEA. When I was an undergraduate back in the 1970s, one of my professors, Bill Field, was a big fan and would assign IEA pamphlets to us. The first thing I ever read by my former, now late Nobel Prize winning colleague, James Buchanan, was an IEA pamphlet that he wrote in 1977 or 1978. And so...
Yeah, and of course you've written several pamphlets for us as well, which for the audience we will link in the description. I think one of the best is Free Trade and How It Enriches Us. Which we will link and is freely available on the IEA's website. There should also be a link to the Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. So that's available in the UK, the US, I think most of the world now. So do go out and order that if you're interested. I think we will call it a day here. So thank you for listening. Do remember to like and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and I will see you next time.